myself is me, but it's also like everything I'm connected to. It's my family, it's my lineage, it's my culture. I understood art as a tool for building community, for building family, for resolving conflict, literally hugging trees. Washington, D.C. has been occupied by our military. The level of policing, the police harassment, displacement of houseless people, kidnapping.
Jessica, welcome to the Artifacts podcast. I am so happy to have you on today. Thank you so much for joining me.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so before we jump into our conversation, I just wanted to ask, who would you like to dedicate this episode to?
Okay, two people came to my mind. One is my grandmother, Budgie, is what we call her. And one is my great-grandfather, Henry Franklin Brown, both of whom were artists, but were born in generations where that wasn't a label that they could claim as fully as I can now. And I draw a lot of inspiration from both of them.
Oh, that's amazing. So that sort of like leads us into my first question, which was essentially, how did you get into art making as a practice? So I'm sure it'll probably be your grandparents' inspiration. So if you can expand a little bit upon that, that would be great.
Yeah, I do think a lot about like my ancestors and like spiritually, like what was I coming into the world with. But as a child, I don't think I was as connected to that history. Like that's something that has emerged as I've grown and just been like curious and asking questions and doing my own genealogical research. But as a child, I was always very much into like collecting things, being like, oh, I could make something out of this. I love the arts and crafts, music, anything like that. And I actually came into my creative practice through performing arts. It was a social justice oriented theater program in Washington, D.C. that I started attending when I was in 10th grade. And it just opened my world. And it was like the first time I was getting language around understanding oppression and internalized oppression, and where we were using theater as a way to tell each other's stories and to witness each other and express ourselves. And it was the first time I felt witnessed as an artist too by the people who were facilitating that program, who are still in my life today. I think from that journey, I was just like, oh, I understood art as a tool for building community, for building family, for resolving conflict, for thinking through really challenging things, for healing. And so my visual art journey, even though I've always been like playing with materials, I think my performance art, my coming up in that space kind of helped inform how I approach my visual art. And thinking about that as a tool, as an archival tool, as a healing tool, as a community building tool, and as a spiritual practice.
That's amazing. So many things were coming up for me, just thinking about how art is such a great way to like bring people together. And I think you've done a really great job at doing that in your practice. Even thinking about our initial connection when we met at Chautauqua. I don't know if you remember, but it was myself, you, and Lena. We came together to decide that we wanted to put something on for everyone, for all of the artists there. So even my initial connection with you was sort of through building community. And so I am thrilled to have shared space with you.
I feel the same way. It was so special, and I felt like a kindred spirit in you.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about like how you describe your work, because you mentioned in your bio that you describe your work as balm and blueprint, right? This idea of how your practice is about healing and guiding light towards liberation. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about what that means for you.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, my practice is like, it starts with myself and what is my relationship to my own body and spirit and psyche. And I want my practice to be reflective of like what I need for myself, and then sharing whatever tools or technologies emerge from me being in that exploration. And when I say myself is me, but it's also like everything I'm connected to. It's my family, it's my lineage, it's my culture, it's the communities that I'm beholden to. So I think about it kind of fractally of like, oh, if this thing is healing for me, and then I can share it with my family, and then I can share it with my larger community, and then how does that kind of reverberate and echo into the world? And I think about liberation and healing as a practice, that it's never a destination that we arrive to, but it's a practice that we cultivate over and over again, and that allows us to, when we're in that practice deeply, it like emerges itself, it emerges its own creativity, it emerges the tools or the next step. Like I do believe it's in my art practice, it's very emergent. So it's like, okay, here's what I feel called to sit with. And I know that if I sit with it long enough, or if I just allow it to be and to exist with it, that it will reveal to me that what's the next step. And I think that's true too in terms of our movements for liberation. Like we can have strategy, but also part of the strategy needs to be listening and stillness and really being able to be responsive to each other and to ourselves and to whatever the container that is holding us.
Oh, I love that so much. I even love the way that you described it in terms of emergence, how something that arrives now in this present moment is connected with your ability to be mindful. And I think that that's so important as we're making work from a space of pure space, because I think the work comes out of that gap anyway, when we're sitting with ourselves and we're able to just be one. And so that has me thinking a little bit about wellness or meditative practices, or even just presence, like you had mentioned, that informs your work. I'm wondering if you have self-care rituals for yourself that translate into the work or into the practice.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I have so many rituals. Like I really could live a whole day where I'm just like just going from one ritual to the next. I do my prayers in the morning, which is connected to my lineages. Every week I tend to my ancestral altar and to the plants in my home. And I speak over my home, over my space. Like I speak like, what am I clearing and what am I honoring or like imbuing the space with? And then I also have a practice of like writing affirmations each week. So I usually pull a card from a deck that I feel a kindred connection to. And then I use that card to create an affirmation. And then there's like Post-its all over my home. I feel like there are a few like spiritual and self-care practices that just like hold me throughout the week and just remind me of like, oh yeah, this is what I want to stay attuned to. And I do that in my studio as well. Like I have affirmations in my studio. Sometimes they're project based. Sometimes they're just like, this is the season that I'm in and what I'm wanting to call in. In every space that I am in, I have an ancestral altar and just remember like who I come from or who are the collective ancestors that are also kind of like guiding this path or who have come before me. Those practices really anchor me. And I would say also just being in nature, hugging trees, like literally hugging trees, going to the water, just being in the world and not just like the human world, but like the different ecologies that I find myself in.
Oh, that's so good. That has me thinking about world building. But as we're building worlds, we're also sort of like tapped into from those from which we come. And so I'm thinking a little bit about your Black American and Jewish ancestry. So I'm wondering how your ancestral traditions like shape the stories that you tell or artistic practice that you have when you're in the studio. How does your lineage inform that work specifically?
It's everything. It's like, so both of those lineages have a deep reverence for ancestors and understanding, like naming who came before. Like even you really, when you were like, who'd you like to dedicate this conversation to? I was like, oh yeah, that's what we do. And also have like a very strong practice of questioning, like asking questions. And so I think both of those are really present in my practice. I incorporate a lot of research and study into my practice, asking questions of the archive, and then also translating those questions personally. So thinking about like, what this is a question about liberation, but how am I also experiencing that internally? And thinking about our relationship to ourselves and to other people. And so those are like kind of like the meta things that I think really guide my practice, is like rooting in ancestral intelligence and connection and reverence, and being in the practice of like questioning, listening, digging, excavating, and also play and joy. Yeah. And dance and song. Like sound is a really big part of my practice. It doesn't always translate in terms of the visual art, but it's always there. So even sometimes I'll like record myself saying something or singing something, or I'll make a playlist based off a particular theme. And that's like in the space shaping the work, even though you may not see the lyrics or you might not hear the song in the actual installation. So I think just in terms of like how I approach my work, that feels big. And then I think just my own, both of those lineages also, I think, shape why I'm kind of obsessed with liberation. And like the idea of like, what does it mean to be liberated? How do we build liberated, or not even liberated, but liberatory communities? Like, what does liberation look like as a practice? How do we continue to access freedom even while we're surviving and navigating entangled oppressions. And I feel like that's kind of informed my work since the start, like since high school. I've just been like, how do we get free? Like trying to understand the systems that we're living in and how we find a way out or find another way or dream a way beyond that. And I feel like that's also very much informed by my Black and Jewish ancestry.
I think that you do such a great job at getting out into the community and into spaces, thinking about remembrance and ritual. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why it's important for you that your work is not just for viewing, but it's also for like participation and also for someone experiencing the work. Like, how do you want people to embody or move through a space whilst they're experiencing the work? And how does that relate to Black liberatory imagination?
Yeah, I'm really inspired by Afrofuturism. Not just I feel like there's some ways that people talk about Afrofuturism as if like futuristic Black people, and I'm like, actually it's so much deeper than that, and it's actually thinking about different constructions of time and understanding ourselves in a spectrum, in a spiral, as like the past, present, and future is all happening at the same time in the now. And so I think part of that is also recovering the truths about ourselves that are undermined, negated, targeted by systems of oppression. And all of these systems are like telling us who we are, who we can't be, or what we're supposed to, like what's the role we're supposed to play in society. And there's something deeper around excavating and figuring out like what is our actual truth that I think can come out of being in creative space, being in community, surrounding ourselves with the stories that actually root ourselves in our truths and not the truths that are fed back to us. So I think about that moving through a space and thinking about how do I cultivate an embodied memory so that someone, like a lot of what I do is like based in locally in DC. I do a lot of work around Black fugitivity and how enslaved Black folks were escaping and locating like what did that work look like where I live, where I'm from. Then activating those spaces, inviting folks to come in through song, through libations, through dance, through ritual, through art making, so that anytime somebody is back in that space, they have this memory of this moment in community where they have a felt sense of themselves. And that moment then ties them to another point in history where it's like, oh, this is why this particular space or this particular piece of land is important. And that's only accessed because they actually have this memory of like singing a song with a group of people here. And I remember we sang the song because it was connected to the Pearl Escape, which was the largest nonviolent escape attempt in the United States that most people in DC don't know about. But it's like if we can create these moments of memory, then actually we don't have to depend on the archive to tell our stories, the archive that's being actively erased right now in the United States. So it's like, how do we create embodied memories so that we are the keepers of the story? We are the keepers of our truths, that we don't necessarily have to rely on the state. We don't have to rely on the state to tell the truth, that we know the truths in our bodies and within our communities, and those stories are held and cared for and active. Like it's not just like something we read in a book, it's something we experience together. So I try to bring, sometimes when I do installation work, I try to bring sound into it, or I try to bring movement into it. And I always try to activate the space in some way so that folks can create an embodied experience for themselves. Basically kind of like taps into like the vagus nerve. It can like actually live in the body and it's not just something that's viewed.
Oh, I love that so much. I love it so much. Like I have goosebumps thinking about it because I'm currently in a fellowship program, and it's talking about like the connection between art and wellness. And
Yeah.
this lady, like she came in and she talked about like social prescribing. And social prescribing is just like, instead of like sending someone to therapy, but it doesn't replace therapy. It's just like another form of, just sort of like healing, sort of getting through something. And she literally described exactly everything that you're talking about, how people can go out into community and through connecting with one another, through shared memory, they're able to heal themselves like in real time, and how people are just so much better because of it. And so the work that you're doing, I think is just so vital. And thank you for the work, because, we really need it. I think it's so important. And so that has me thinking about community as a whole. So within your facilitation, like in community, I'm wondering if you could sort of like walk us through sort of beginning of someone entering the space and then how they would feel like leaving? Like, what's the transformation piece that happens there?
It's different every time, but I would say there are some like anchors of things that must happen or things that must be curated into the space. So it depends on if it's a workshop, if it's an installation, if it's a ritual of remembrance. I would say all of them are very collaborative. They often, so we usually start with some kind of like setting an intention, naming an ancestor, just kind of like a dedicated practice, naming the land that we're on, naming the indigenous people who stewarded the land and continue to live here. And then there's usually some kind of connective piece where like people are doing pair shares or something where people are able to connect with each other, just kind of break the ice. Usually I'll bring in some form of study. Sometimes it's a gallery walk. It's like different posters. Sometimes it's objects, artifacts that people can touch and feel. Sometimes it's zines. So I have like a zine making practice where I like write little notes and doodles and quotes and sound bites. So sometimes it's going through that. We often share like, okay, what's coming up from what we're learning here together? Or like, I picked up on this piece of information, what's resonating, what is emerging from me? Because I think also when we sit with knowledge begets more knowledge, or like wisdom begets more wisdom. So if we sit with something and it's like, oh, that actually makes me think of that time that I was sitting with my auntie and what she was sharing with me about her life. And so it also emerges all of this information that is only accessible when we're together. Like when we're in community, can reflect back to each other. And then there's usually some kind of creative practice. Sometimes that's song, sometimes that's movement, sometimes that's like kind of like tableaus or writing. Music always feels really important because that is like the way that we remember and heal culturally. And so music is often in the space, or we're making music together, or there's just instruments that are present. So if someone feels inspired, that like a beat could pop off at any time. And then there's usually some kind of closing. That's like for a more facilitated experience. I think when it's like something that's more like an installation, like I'm not present, I often try and find like, oh, can I put a library in the space where there's like maybe like 10 books that people can like mark up or read, and then the next person can pick up and see where somebody marked in, or maybe there's like blank zines that people can write in, so that there's some kind of like back and forth conversation. Yeah. So I think, but yeah, I guess the elements of connection, play, study, and like creative exchange always feel like they're present in the space.
I love that, in a shared space, because, oftentimes within our practices for visual artists, it's sort of like an isolated solo thing. I spend a lot of time like in my studio by myself, so I also like enjoy going out into the community and make work of some sort together. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about sort of this idea of play in your studio and how this comes up for you in terms of like materiality. Like, what are the materials that you're using at the moment, or materials that have sparked or piqued interest, and how do you use those materials to sort of storytell? Or how do you choose the materials to communicate what it is that you're trying to communicate?
I'm in a weird place in my practice right now because I just finished this big commission that was a stained glass piece, which is like, doesn't have that much room for play in it. It's like the same, like you gotta like each piece, it's kind of like a puzzle. It's very exact. But the devising process for that piece involved me creating a series of mixed media pieces where I was using papyrus paper, like cotton cloth, tobacco cloth, which is like a particular cloth that was used to protect tobacco plants. I often have like corn, beads, black-eyed peas, different kinds of like nuts or things that I've like foraged, pokeberry. So there's always like lots of natural materials around. They don't always make it into the work, or sometimes they're like curated in, like the work is curated with those materials around it, but it's not necessarily in the work. The question was around play. So often I just like have a bunch of materials. I'll just make, and I think actually some of this I learned from you actually was like just making papers so that I can like collage with them or incorporate them into other things. So sometimes I'll just like have scraps around that I keep intentionally because I'm like, I know this, maybe I could use this for something. And I also keep blank paper around so that if I'm specifically using like liquid mediums or paint, that if I'm working on a piece and there's a lot of paint left on the palette, then I use all of what's left over on another piece. And it doesn't have to be intentional. Like it is just kind of like, let me just like see how to spread this around.
What could happen.
And over time, things will kind of like evolve, like that piece. Like sometimes I like working with the scraps of a thing more than the thing itself. So yeah, I think just having materials around, having surfaces that can be like something that can be pasted on or painted on. I think those are some of the ways that I play in my space. And I sing, I dance in my studio. When it's quiet and no one's around, like I'll talk to myself, I laugh at myself. So I think that's also a part of the process and the work. Yeah, those are
I
the
actually
things.
wanted to actually say about that because when we were at Chautauqua, like you know how there were just like sort of open studios. That was
Yeah.
actually one of the things that really excited me. Just being around, just seeing like how different artists work. And I actually do remember you dancing. One particular time I was like walking past and you were just dancing in there and it just made me so happy because I'm just like, okay, I'm not alone. Like there's someone else that like does this too and just sort of like
Yes.
gets you in the mood to make work. But something else
Yes.
you had mentioned just now, I think is really special too, because I've been thinking about this a lot in my practice. But you mentioned how like one thing that you're working on sort of like creates the next thing. So it in a way is sort of like generative. And so I'm wondering like how does sustainability show up for you? And does it
Yeah.
sort of like inform the ways in which you reuse materials or because obviously the materials that we use like hold memory as well. And so as we're moving the materials through a process, it's also moving that story and that narrative. So can you talk a little bit about like sort of the movement of stories or the movement of sustainability towards the future? Because you mentioned time as well. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
I think my practice could definitely be more sustainable. I'm still working on that, like environmentally, like thinking about what are the materials. I use a lot of acrylic paint in my work because I love color and just like the vibrancy of it. But it's not the best in terms of environment. I think that's something that is still like a learning edge for me. I think the practice of just using scraps, like not letting things go to waste, reusing things that would normally go in the trash, reusing papers. Sometimes I'll like use like even my like junk mail that I get. I'll use that just to like layer up a surface. And in some ways that feels like it probably doesn't make a huge dent in like environmental sustainability, but it is something. I think about like each piece kind of reveals like what is supposed to be next. And sometimes that message doesn't come through clearly and I'm like, okay, well just like mark up a page. Like just make a mark and see what happens. Sometimes I see what happens and I really like it. And sometimes I see what happens and I'm like, oh, this isn't doing
Yeah.
anything for me. And then I'll be like, well, let me rip it up or let me cover it up or let me, just like continuing to play with the thing and work a thing or just like let it sit around and see like maybe it'll find its way into something else. Work that I just finished. Stained glass has so much scraps. Like there's like a lot of scrap glass. And so I've been also thinking about like, oh, how can I play with these scrap pieces and maybe build something like what I created was these like 6 2D panels and now I'm like, oh, maybe I can create some kind of like 3D form with wire and glass. I think I'm always like one of the practices just like working with scraps and the scraps actually become like they're in conversation with the work or they allow the work to live on in other iterations. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about collage? Because you were also one of the first artists that I met who also had like a deep collage practice embedded into their practice. So can you talk
Yeah.
about how collage has showed up for you and how it allows you to sort of like think through ideas as well?
Yeah, I'm a mind map girly. Like I love taking notes. I love having a journal. I love like taking bits and pieces of like this thing and that thing and figuring out how they all connect to each other. So for me, collage just is like kind of a natural way that my mind thinks. It's like, oh, this thing is connected to this thing, which is also somehow like reminds me of this phrase that reminds me of this song. And so, yeah, I think collage is just a way for those things to meet on in their own landscape, in their own plane. That's like these actually live together in a visual way. Sometimes, like I've been thinking about, this is going to sound funny. I'm still trying to figure out how to articulate this clearly, but I've been thinking about where portraiture and landscape meet. And specifically in terms of thinking about, I've been creating these, what I've been calling fugitive landscapes that are inspired by the names of people who either experienced enslavement or escaped their enslavement. And so I'm like imagining them, which feels like portraiture, even though it's not their physical form, but it's like the cosmos of who they are, but imagining them as these like kind of like in these landscapes. For me, it's like kind of like collaging like mediums or ways of approaching the work. So there's like some things that are a little bit representational and some things that are a little bit more like poetic and metaphorical or that nod to a thing. Sometimes there are symbols that I incorporate into like patterns in the background, or there's like a certain like a number that's important that you'll see like repeated over and over in terms of like how many strokes I use. So I think about painting also as like a collage practice too. For me, it's kind of like there's a code in this thing. There's a story that
Yeah.
exists here. This story also exists with this concept or this practice or this particular piece of material. Sometimes I like to like embroider things onto work. So also thinking about collage is like mixing textiles and thread, but also that feels like it speaks to an ancestral practice of like my grandmother used to quilt and she used to embroider all the clothes for her kids. So like thinking about like the collage is both the medium, but it's also the practice that is I'm speaking back to and reflecting back to ancestrally.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much. When you mentioned about your fugitive landscapes, I thought about a work that I did recently, but it was also about a similar thing. It was about how there was this land in Bermuda that was essentially taken. And it was a small little fishing Black community who lived in this area and they were displaced. And so
Yeah.
the work was about the landscape and how we can reclaim the land. And what I did was I paired portraiture with the landscape and reimagined landlords, women as landlords of specific areas. It was a phenomenal work and quite challenging because the land, like, it was tied up with a court case and some of the people and descendants were suing the government because of this. Like it was, and so I used like some of the documents in the work as well. It was a really great work. And it had me also thinking about like how we experience the land and how the land is also there to sort of like reclaim as well.
I love that. It makes me think also of like how we're in conversation with history and what's been documented. Like bringing that collage is the medium through which you can bring that into this larger story that people are experiencing.
Yeah, definitely. And it also makes me think about your Black liberation piece as well. Like how if you can sort of like use historical fiction to create an entirely new story or an entirely new world based upon something that's happened in the past. But then that's also like what you were saying, this idea of like past, present, and future happening like simultaneously, like
Yes.
collapsing a moment. So I really love that. I guess that has me thinking about like the future, looking ahead, just thinking about like where we are currently at this particular moment in the world where there's so many things that are happening. For your practice, I'm wondering what does it look like for you in the future, and what do you want to sort of like carry with you beyond this moment?
Oh, that's such a hard question right now. It's rough out here. I live in Washington D.C. and for folks that are listening, Washington D.C. has been occupied by our military. So the level of policing, the level of police harassment, displacement of houseless people, kidnapping of migrants and immigrants and refugees, like it's very heightened here. So I think part of me feels like my art practice is never enough to respond to the moment and provide the things that would like interrupt the violences that are happening here. But there is another part of me that knows that looking to the ways that our ancestors practiced liberation during slavery can reveal a lot to us around how we can organize ourselves to resist together and to care for each other in this moment and beyond whatever happens next. So I do root myself in that and thinking about like, well, what are the practices, like even when we are in formations of resistance, how do we continue to care for each other? How do we provide for each other's needs? How do we create systems of like mutual aid and think about like, what are all the tools that our ancestors used? And some of those are legal routes. Some of those are like direct action routes. Some of those are armed resistance. Some of those are building their own communities and growing their own food. And so I think part of what fuels or inspires my creative practice in this moment is like really rooting in the fact that we have what we need to survive. This isn't the first time that the systems of oppression have tightened in this way, and that we can kind of find our own resilience and our own deeper truths and the practices that will help us to survive as best we can and survive as many of our people as we can, and imagine what a different kind of world could look like. So I don't know if that's like it's not a fuzzy future because things feel dire in this moment, but it does feel like rooted in a knowing that we can get through this, and that we can imagine a new way, like a better way to create a world that is sustainable, that is caring, where people live interdependently and everybody's needs are met and is free of harm and state violence. And I guess I pray that my art can be a window or like a door to thinking about those things and remembering for ourselves who we actually are.
Absolutely. I think that's a great legacy to envision and to conjure up. It actually has me thinking about Alexis Pauline Gumbs. Are you familiar with her work?
I love her. So I'm working on this study kit right now about Black fugitivity, and she actually reviewed this study kit and like gave me like brilliant feedback. Oh my God, I love her. Yes.
Oh, that's fantastic. Honestly, like she's also like someone I've been reading for years now, and every time I read her work, I'm just like, wow, like if I could make something visually in the same way that she explains things, like narratively,
Yes.
it's just like, it's mind-blowing. She's amazing. And
Definitely
yeah,
has a gift.
what you explained had me thinking a lot about her practice.
Yeah.
Speaking about reading, are there any books that you could recommend to some of our listeners that really inform your practice, or books that you think people should read, like must-reads that you have in mind?
There's a few that I have in mind, specifically around Black fugitivity. The two books that have been kind of guiding source of wisdom and knowledge are Closer to Freedom by Tina Camp, and another book called Slavery's Exiles by Sylviane Diop. Outside of that, I think Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown has been like a source that I continue to go back to. Also, The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. That's a book that I return to every now and then. One is called Opening to Spirit by Caroline Shola Arewa, and it's looking at like healing practices through the lens of African spirituality. And then this book is like Gem, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And she talks a lot about indigenous wisdom and science and like relationship with plants in our natural world. So I would say those are like some of the Bibles for me that have like just kind of opened my mind or really affirmed for me something in my own practice.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Jess, this has been like really amazing and enlightening and nourishing even for me. And so final question before we hop off, I wanted to ask you about sort of like this idea of like the work as a portal to new spaces or to new ideas. And so we just talked about this idea of world building. I think that's come up a lot in the conversation. But in terms of like a world that you feel most hopeful and most connected to, what would you like to leave us with today in thinking about this idea of like a new world?
These are such great questions. Just wanted to say I really, really appreciate this conversation and what it's like allowing me to presence myself to. I think what I would say is that the world that we dream of is already inside of us, and the work is to clear the path so that it can emerge with care, with dignity, with love, and that we can respect and honor the worlds that live in each of us and find ways for them to exist together.
I received that. Thank you so much for that. And where can people find you online?
My website, jessicavaloris.com. I'm also on Instagram at Jessica Valoris. And I'm also on Patreon if people feel inspired to give. It's just patreon.com/Jessica Valoris.
Thank you so much, Jess. I really appreciate this.
Thank you so much. This has been a lovely conversation. I appreciate it too.
Thank you for listening to Artifacts, where we explore the art of creative living. I'm your host, Gherdai Hassell. If today's conversation moved you, inspired you, or sparked something within you, share it with someone who might be interested and who might need it too. You can connect with me on social media at Hassell_free or on my website at www.gherdaihassell.com, or you can join my print club. Until next time, keep creating, keep feeling, and remember, art affects everything. See you next time.